All right. Okay, well, again, thanks to both the NBER and the Department of Transportation for support and for the opportunity to talk about my joint research with Bei Lee, my colleague at CMU, who's also on the call. Let's just jump right in. So spatial mismatch is an all too familiar problem in American cities. Serious research on this goes at least back 50 years to the McCone Commission established by Lyndon Johnson after the Watts riots of 1965, which concluded that inadequate transportation to jobs played a large role in creating that urban unrest. Here we are nearly 60 years later, and many American low-income urban residents still struggle to get from their homes to good jobs. Part of the reason the problem is still with us, the well-known drawbacks of traditional transportation technologies. Conventional fixed route public transit systems can never reach all locations, and they can struggle to serve the poor in the urban periphery in a cost-effective way, given their network structure. And of course, the high fixed costs and negative environmental externalities associated with private vehicle ownership limit the appeal of public policies focused on providing the urban poor with their own cars. But now we have some new transportation technologies, right? We've got ride hailing, and we've got a host of other smartphone activated, relatively new, flexible transportation options, that provide some of the flexibility of personal vehicle ownership without, the fixed costs, right? So anybody with a smartphone and a bit of money can now rent e-bikes, e-scooters, cars and vans and other modes of transportation. Could this proliferation of new modes help plug some of the gaps in our existing transportation systems? And could modest subsidies that place these options within the reach of urban low-income households provide us with new leverage around this old problem of spatial mismatch, right? So, for us, this boils down to a number of essential research questions, starting with these. To what extent will disadvantaged citizens really use these new options, even if they're fairly generously subsidized? To what extent will their geographic mobility be increased? And to what extent would their socioeconomic mobility be increased? So I'm actually going to very briefly summarize very preliminary findings from two projects that have received Department of Transportation support. The first one is looking at the impact of access to ride hailing on the income and employment of low-income mothers. We're doing this through an RCT, again, with the participation of my co-PIs, Bei Lee and Lowell Tabler, a labor economist at CMU that many of you know, and support from other sources. A key enabler of this RCT in Pittsburgh comes from our partnership with the Allegheny County Department of Human Services, which has spent decades investing in a data warehouse that combines a lot of really useful data sets. Through them, we get access to birth records that identify mothers with children in our target age range. DHS also has information on individuals' receipt of social services that target low-income households. They also have information, contact information that actually enables us to offer participation in this RTC to a random sample of poor mothers in Pittsburgh. And so we're actually able to recruit more than 1,000 low-income mothers in the region and randomly assign them to treatment and control groups. And DHS also has access to UI records from the state. So in principle, we can measure the impact of treatment on formal employment and income on a quarterly basis. The study design is fairly straightforward. Treatment group members receive $200 per month of ride-hailing credits for 6 months, and we can track how these credits are used to some extent. Control group members receive $200 in riding credits for 1 month, but then they rotate out. Everybody downloads and uses a GPS tracking app. Unfortunately, it's not the always-on GPS app that Steve and his co-authors have access to. Nevertheless, we worked with our participants to try and get this on and keep this on, and it allows us to measure the impact of treatment on geographic mobility. And then through our partnership with DHS, we can also indirectly, right? We don't get access to the individual records, but DHS can do the statistical analysis for us, measure the impact of treatment on socioeconomic mobility, both in the short run, right, while the rides are being offered, and in the longer run after people rotate out of the active phase of our study. So here are some preliminary results on geographic mobility. The bottom line here, the bottom blue line, sort of indicates ride-hailing rides of a specific length, right, to a specific destination. And the rest of the graph gives you a sense of both the average transit time on public transportation to make the same trip and the variance of public transportation times associated with that trip. And what's immediately obvious is that when folks in our treatment group use the ride-hailing service, they can get to their destination much more quickly, and the variance around that transit time is much smaller. So, on average, we're estimating a decline in transit time of around 67%. Using our RCT, we can also estimate what the impact of access to this additional transportation resource that we're providing, for free is on overall mobility as measured in our GPS tracker app. And that really depends on the definition of mobility, the particular metric that we use, and also other aspects of our statistical comparison. But the bottom line is we get pretty large and statistically significant increases in mobility, and kind of a modal result suggests an increase of a not quite doubling in mobility of treatment relative to control, which is a pretty big effect, bigger, than we expected. In terms of the results on socioeconomic mobility so far, we focused on measures of formal employment and earnings as reflected in UI records. We do see effects. Interestingly, they seem to fully manifest themselves in the third quarter after enrollment. So this is at a time when most of the people in our treatment group are actually moving off of the active study phase, the 6 months of access to ride-hailing credit. The impact on formal employment is pretty large, right? That effect by the third quarter after enrollment is 13 percentage points. That is statistically significant, although just barely so. It appears to persist into the fourth quarter. We also get an increase in income, quarterly income, as reflected in the UI records. And again, this seems to fully manifest itself in the third quarter after enrollment. The number is large. It's almost $800. The statistical precision is not high, right? So it's pretty imprecisely estimated, but it does appear to be persistent. And, relative to, $1,200 of ride-hailing credits over 6 months, the impact on income, if it truly persists, suggests a pretty high ROI. But we want to, place, a number of caveats in this, otherwise optimistic picture. This is just a partial picture of the longer run impacts on our participants. We're still gathering data from the UI system. These results could change. But we do see evidence that there's a pretty big effect on formal employment. There is an effect, although an imprecisely estimated one, on income. But another thing that's really surprising is that a very large fraction of the people who initially sign up for our study actually don't follow through all the procedures that will enable them to actually use rides. And so take-up is pretty low. We're also at a much earlier stage in a second, pilot RCT. Here, the sample is quite small. It's only 100, where we're trying to provide access to a menu of transportation options, right? Not just, ride hailing. Instead, we're looking at providing people with access to bike sharing, scooter sharing. We are giving them a free bus pass that lasts for up to 12 months. And we are also giving them some access to a car rental service, right? So this is what the treatment group members get in this second study. And here we're not distinguishing on the basis of gender, really any low income urban resident, who meets specific criteria can participate. The control group members in this case don't get any access to transportation options. They're just compensated for sending us data and filling out surveys. Again, everybody's downloading and using a GPS tracker app that allows for measurement of the impact of treatment on geographic mobility. And also we're getting information from our transportation providers who are sharing individual trip-level data with us on treatment group participants' usage of their particular transportation service. So we can actually look at, utilization and how this varies across individual characteristics, right, and other variables like weather. Again, we're relying on a partnership with DHS to track the impact, both during and after the active phase of the study on things like income, employment, and utilization of social services. So there's that ability to use administrative data, at least in principle, to measure the impact on socioeconomic mobility. We've just started this. We're just a few months in. So this is super preliminary data. We do seem to be observing an increase in our various measures of mobility when we compare the treatment and control. But again, the data are just coming in. We also, as I've already indicated, can look at how individuals are using a particular transportation resource. So for instance, here is a kind of map of the bike sharing network in Pittsburgh that's being utilized by some members of our treatment group. The blue dots represent origins. The orange dots represent destinations. We have a handful of people that are using this bike sharing network, fairly extensively, but only a handful, right? So what we're seeing so far, and again, just the beginning, our treatment group participants are enthusiastically using their free bus passes, but there's pretty limited take-up of other options. And that's the case even when our subsidies are fairly generous, and at least up to now, the weather has been fairly favorable by Pittsburgh standards. Now, this could indicate that, members of our, treatment group are, just not really aware of or never use anything other than the bus. But in fact, we know through surveys that some of these individuals are paying fairly large sums on a regular basis to use ride-hailing services. Many of them do not seem to see these electric micromobility options as an attractive way to get around. That's not something that we necessarily want to come to strong conclusions about yet, right? We've got many months yet to run, but we were struck by the limited take-up of some of these other options. And of course, at this point, we're months away from any useful evidence on the impact of treatment on socioeconomic outcomes. That may be hard to come by until we bring in another tranche of participants. So we've got funding for another 100, but obviously we're actively seeking funding to expand the scope of this study even further. All right, let me wrap up. Smartphones have been used widely among urban low-income populations. This enables us to run RCTs in which we provide individuals in these populations with access to new smartphone-enabled transportation options and track the geographic mobility thereby induced in a nuanced, detailed, and granular way. In many contexts, it's going to be possible to link this to high-quality administrative data on things like income, employment, utilization of social services, so that we can, in principle, track the impact of increased geographic mobility on a broad range of socioeconomic outcomes. We think these data methods open up new avenues of research that are extremely relevant for policymakers seeking to address issues of transportation equity and transportation insecurity. And if we have these new tools with which to address the old problem of spatial mismatch, then at least members of my team think we're morally obligated to assess how they can best be used. All right, thank you very much. I'll stop right there.